The M25, it's 117 miles of not very well regarded motorway that runs around the outskirts of London. You've probably heard of it. It is mostly bollocks, that's fair, but what if I told you the M25 began its life in the 1930s? Well, I just did, and today we're going to talk about it. My name is John, welcome to Auto Shenanigans. Why not consider subscribing? The M25 story begins in 1919 with the formation of the UK government's Ministry of Transport, who would plan and oversee any major road building projects around the country, which made a lot of sense because at the time there were no major roads or a cohesive road network, and with predictions suggesting that over the years vehicle ownership would increase, a more efficient road network would be required, and spoiler alert, they were right. Now, if you're looking for someone to blame for the nightmare that is the M25, then we'd do well to point the finger at Charles Bressie or Breesy, because he was the guy that started the whole thing. He was an engineer and surveyor specialising in road design, and he was good enough to be appointed as chief engineer for the government's Ministry of Transport. Nice one, Chaz. Charlie was assigned with the task of surveying London and the surrounding area in order to develop the highways, which he called the Highway Development Survey. And it turns out this was a bit more difficult than he thought, because imagine one surprise, in the 1930s, when they turned their smartphones on, Google Maps was not to be found. Initially, Charlie used existing maps and documentation, but quickly realised these are bollocks. Or, to put it another way, they weren't accurate enough for the purpose of planning a road. So what do? You come to Croydon, where at the time we'd have found Croydon Airport, and from here Charlie chartered a plane all to himself which would fly up and down the area, allowing him to conduct a far more accurate survey of the land, which after a few years led to the publication of his Highway Development Survey. And looking at it, we can see how it laid the foundations for some of the roads and motorways that we're using today, including the M25. But we're not quite there yet, because Charlie's plan didn't actually feature the M25, mainly because motorways hadn't been invented yet. Instead, it had the South Orbital Road, a road that was designed to relieve the A25, which had seen an increase in traffic heading towards Kent and on to Dover. The South Orbital Road was planned to be a substantial upgrade and built as a dual carriageway, with the creative vision that it would be a tree-lined parkway, if that's the term, with beautiful countryside views, which probably worked in the 1930s. Today, not so much. The route of the South Orbital Road would have been something like this, and if we add in the North Orbital Road part of Charlie's plan, we can see that it's awfully similar to the modern-day M25. And then some Austrian bloke threw his toys out the pram and we had to put everything on hold. No, wrong one. For f***'s sake. Right, yeah, that one, good. Well, not good, but anyway, road building was on hold until at least 1945, which turned out to be the 1950s by the time the authorities pulled their finger out and decided to have another crack at building a road network, although at least this time it would be easy because Charlie had done most of the work. It would have been easy, but local councils be local councils, and they had to fiddle with the plan to suit their ongoing requirements, which prolongs us to the 1960s, at which point the Greater London Council, the big dogs, said, nah, this plan's shit, we're doing something else. The GLC had realised that car ownership was on the increase, far more than Charlie had ever anticipated, and they thought his plans were no longer fit for purpose. In hindsight, they were probably right, but there had also been the recent opening of the country's first motorways, and the GLC were thinking, we need in on that sweet, sweet motorway action. So they took Charlie's 1930s plan, ran it through a photocopier at plus 25%, and the end result was the famous London Ringways plan, which turns out to have been a copy of someone else's homework, but with just enough alterations so you wouldn't notice. With their sights set on motorways rather than lovely parkways with trees, some of Charlie's plan had to be reworked. However, when it came to the South Orbital Road, Charlie's route selection was so good it was retained as part of the Ringways project, and since motorways had now been invented, it was allocated the M25 number because originally the South Orbital Road was designed to relieve the A25. A25, M25, it makes perfect sense. Following Charlie's plan but replacing parkway with motorway, they got on with constructing the South Orbital Road, soon to be M25, and right about the time they finished it, the rest of the project was cancelled because money and NIMBYs. It's a familiar story which would ultimately lead to the creation of the M25 as we know it, but let's ignore that for now and look at it from the original plan's point of view, starting at the Addington interchange. Today, the M26 and the M20 meet here, but the M26 was supposed to be the OG M25, so what we're actually looking at is the planned southern terminus for the M25, first designed, if you will, in the 1930s. Heading west from the interchange, and the motorway pretty much to the millimetre follows the route that Charlie came up with all those years ago. However, when you reach Westerham, the plan suggests that we're missing something, and indeed we are. Charlie's plan involved building a junction of sorts connecting the village to his wonderful parkway, and in the 1930s that may well have been a jolly nice idea. However, when the plans were later upgraded to a motorway, the local residents were having none of it, setting up protests and campaigns to fight the construction of both the motorway and a junction right by their village. They almost got their way. The compromise was that the junction would be deleted from the plan, but the motorway would still go ahead. Now, whilst I'm sure Charlie's plan was absolutely perfect, they did have to make a few changes to suit the construction of a motorway. Charlie had only envisaged an average speed of 13 miles an hour after all. The first deviation from Charlie's route occurs around Merstham and Redhill. Here the original idea was for the parkway to follow this sort of a route, but this was changed when the motorway plans came along. The reasons for the changes were because Charlie's route featured corners that were thought up in the 1930s and considered a bit too tight for a motorway, so an alternative route was found in order to smooth out the corners and make it more suited for high-speed travel. Furthermore, the rerouting of the motorway moved it away from the towns, whereas before the plan suggested it run right through, which wasn't a great idea for a motorway. Interestingly, when Charlie's survey was first published in the late 1930s, it led to councils allocating pieces of land in preparation for the road's construction. And we can still find a piece of land allocated to the new road all these years later in the town of Fetcham. It doesn't look like much today, but had Charlie's plan been carried out, we'd have possibly been looking at a dual carriageway or maybe even the M25. But we aren't. Why is this? Because the residents of Fetcham got lucky. When it came to building the motorway through this area, it was decided that Charlie's route was not appropriate and instead the motorway would be routed a different way. No problem with that, but the land had already been allocated in line with Charlie's plan in the 1930s, resulting in various expanses of land no longer having a use. Over the years, the land has been built on or utilised for other purposes, but that's not the case with the small wooded area in Fetcham. It's 1930s allocated land awaiting a road, and currently it still is. Luxury flats coming soon, I guess. There's another deviation from Charlie's route between Heathrow and the M40. Much like Fetcham, the residents of Ivor Heath got lucky when the proposed parkway, soon to be motorway, was rerouted. Built to plan, the residents living on Trewarden Avenue wouldn't have been living there due to a motorway being built instead. Interestingly, if we look at an old map, we can see the area of land allocated in the 1930s for its construction. Having reached the M40, it's at this point that Charlie's South Orbital Road comes to an end. His idea was that the road would terminate most likely at the Denham roundabout, where you turn onto another large dual carriageway that was part of his North Orbital Road. That idea was carried over to the Ringways project in as much as the North Orbital's route would mostly become Ringway 3, but the M25 from this point onwards doesn't feature on any of Charlie's plans. So what parts of the modern M25 can we attribute to Charlie and his 1930s survey or plan? Well, these sections were built pretty much as per his plan. These sections were a modification of his plan, and then there's the M26, which was going to be the M25. We've only briefly mentioned it, but Charlie also came up with the route for the North Orbital Road. Not all of it was built, but what they did build was going to be allocated the number M16 rather than M25, so I'm not sure it counts as part of the OG M25. However, it was still Charlie's plan that resulted in its construction, and without it, there is no modern M25. Therefore, the M25 as we know it is the result of stitching up two parts of a modified 1930s plan that made it to the construction stage before the rest was cancelled. Taking what had been built, they connected it up like so, off that odd bit to call it the M26 and creating a motorway ring around London. It wasn't the grand vision that Charlie had in mind, and it wasn't the grand vision that the GLC had either, but it was a vision, and it's as good as it was going to get because there was no more funding for the building of elaborate motorway networks, and nobody wanted them anyway. I'm sure Charlie would have been disappointed. He went to all of that effort to get a plane and map out the perfect road, only for it to later be turned into the M25. It is a wonderful what-if question though, isn't it? What if Charlie's plan had been completed and we had tree-lined parkways running around everywhere? It'd be delightful, I'm sure, and maybe change the shape of the capital's road network for better or worse. Well, who knows, but we did get the M25 and that's quite telling, I think. So the next time you're cursing the M25 while sat in traffic, you at least know who to blame, and I hope you found this look at the sort of 1930s M25 as fascinating as I did. Thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Bye-bye. Interestingly, when Charlie's plan, survey. Interestingly, had Charlie's plan. It's a fucking survey though, isn't it? That's a massive dog shit. You come to Croydon, where at the time we'd have good noise. Croydon Airport, and from here Charlie chartered an airport. He didn't charter an airport. What's your flavour? Cheese flavour.